So I generally put these up on YouTube for a week, just in case anybody wants to see them on the normal YouTube channel, where you get all Rabbi Wein's shiurim as well. And then at the end of the week, I delete it, just for anyone who hasn't attended the shiur. Okay, we're actually about to start a new Mishnah on Mem Aleph Amud Beis 41b. It's about 10 lines from the top, something like that. Yud Tes is Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag. So that'll be a new Mishnah. I just wanted to briefly go over what we did last week, and in fact in the previous weeks, which was a Gemara on the previous Mishnah. And I just wanted to add some little gloss to some comments I made last week, which I omitted. So the previous Mishnah had given us a couple of famous takonot of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Tana and the hero who salvaged, if you like, Jewish leadership following the destruction of the Second Temple. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was quoted in our Mishnah as instituting two takonot, two changes, if you like, in regulation. The first was in relation to Sukkot, which was the reason it appears in our Masechta. And that was to require the taking of the Arba Minim for all 7 days of Sukkot, even outside the Beis HaMikdash. And if you remember, the source Torah law is that the Lulav and Esrog and the Arba Minim are taken only on day one, Mitzvah HaTorah, except in Yerushalayim, or according to another reading, within the walls of the Beis HaMikdash, where they're taken all 7 days. But outside Yerushalayim, outside the Beis HaMikdash, the din of Arba Minim is only 1 day, because the pasuk reads, "Ulekachtem lachem b'yom harishon," creates Hadar Chapos Tamorim, etc. You should take for yourself on the first day. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, as a commemoration of the Beis HaMikdash, instituted that the Arba Minim should be taken for all 7 days, wherever the person is, whether they're in Yerushalayim, outside Yerushalayim, or in Chutz La'aretz. And of course, that's the minhag we have today. We take the Lulav and Esrog all 7 days, wherever we are, as a result of this takana, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He called the Zeicher LeMikdash, following the destruction of Beis HaMikdash, if you like. The routine of the Beis HaMikdash is preserved, and it's preserved worldwide by us taking the Lulav and Esrog all 7 days. That was the one takana. The second takana was a more complicated one, and it related to when one could start to eat from the new crop that had grown. And the new crop that had just been harvested, just reaped, could not be eaten until the carbon ha'omer was brought on the 16th of Nisan, the first day of Chol Hamoed Pesach. That's according to the Torah. Only then can you start to eat from the new crop. Otherwise, prior to that date, you have to still eat from the bread manufactured from the old crop, the crop that was harvested after the last year's 15th of Nisan. But if you want to eat from the latest crop, the crop that grew this year, you have to wait until after the carbon ha'omer. Now, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, again, there was no carbon ha'omer. Min ha'Torah, you could actually start to eat from the new crop from dawn of the 16th of Nisan. There is no carbon ha'omer during the day, and therefore the actual sunrise of the day would make it permitted for a person to eat from the new crop. However, he instituted a law that says you shouldn't eat until the end of that day. And he did so because of a remarkable concern he had that in a future year, perhaps even in the year to come, the Beis HaMikdash might drop down suddenly from heaven on the night of the 16th of Nisan, and the next morning there would be the need to bring a carbon ha'omer. And if people were unaware of this and they continued to eat in the way they had done in previous years, where there wasn't a Beis HaMikdash, continued to eat the new crop from the beginning of the day, they would be breaking a Torah rule, because after all, now this year, as a result of a miracle, the Beis HaMikdash was there, and therefore they need to wait until the carbon ha'omer is brought which would be later on in the day. In order to prevent any error of this sort, in such a remarkable situation, he instituted that the new crop should not be eaten until the end of the day, because certainly by the end of the day, even if there was a miraculous appearance of Beis HaMikdash, the Korban Omer would have been brought. So people would be in the safe side, delaying the first eating of the new crop until the end of the day. So it's all rather complicated. But the reason I brought this into discussion last week is because, if you remember, the issue around this second takana was that it seemed to imply that the Beis HaMikdash would drop miraculously from heaven. And that's how the third Beis HaMikdash might suddenly appear at our doorstep. We would see this giant Beis HaMikdash being lowered into place by a heavenly crane and landing on the Har HaBais without the need for us to do anything. And because it might happen instantaneously and people might not know about it, therefore there was this particular concern which required the takana of Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. So it was clearly implying in the takana that there would be a miraculous a descent of the third Beis HaMikdash. And I said to you that really was only one side of two possibilities which find their way through Medrash and through the Rishonim and Achronim. There was this miraculous appearance which Rashi discusses and Tosas discusses, and it's certainly in line with some Gemaras and some Midrashim, that it might suddenly appear. And there is another line which says that the Beis HaMikdash might actually appear much more gradually, much more rationally, much more through the means of man and not through descent from the heaven. A man instituted Beis HaMikdash. When the Mashiach comes, planning permission is sought. The Beis HaMikdash is built brick by brick by whatever source of technology we have at the time. It doesn't descend from heaven, in which case this would be a gradual appearance of Beis HaMikdash, and there would be no need for a takana Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, because it wouldn't suddenly appear on the scenes. It would take years before it were actually built. And there are two schools. There's that miraculous school of the coming of the Mashiach and the Beis HaMikdash appearing on the scenes, and then there is the more rationalist, gradualistic, more Maimonidean approach to Mashiach and the Beis HaMikdash, and trying to reconcile the two is very difficult. And I brought one possible reconciliation, but I just wanted to bring another one because this is perhaps a more famous one, and I'll just share my screen. 1 second. Not sure what screen I should share. This one, I think. Okay. There's a famous pasuk in Yeshayahu, which is part of a Haftarah, which I'm showing you over here if you're reading it. When the Mashiach comes, HaKaton Yihye Lo Elef, the smallest person will be like 1,000. Terrible translation over here. The smallest shall become a clan. The word Elef has been translated by whoever it is on Safaria as a clan. Well, I know there's a Glasgow conference at the moment in Scotland, but to translate Elef as a clan, which sounds like a Scottish clan, is most peculiar and quite interesting. But never mind. For Hatzair and the youngest, L'goyotzum shall be like a mighty nation. In other words, when the Mashiach comes, this is what will happen, that someone who's relatively insignificant will suddenly become so significant. Maybe we won't recognize that the person who was insignificant suddenly becomes so significant. Maybe that's the meaning. Who knows what the meaning is? This is a prophetic statement of Yeshayahu. But here's the important bit. Ani Hashem, I am Hashem, Be'ita Achishena, which I've highlighted over here, which he's translated nicely over here. I, the Lord, will speed it in due time, which is actually a very good translation. Be'ita means at its due time. Achishena, I will speed it. I will hasten it. I will hasten it in its due time. And it doesn't take a lot of grammatical knowledge to understand that there's some sort of contradiction here. The two words are actually in contradiction to each other, and they're juxtaposed, which leads to a bit of a mystery in its interpretation. If something is at its due time, then it isn't going to be speeded up. It'll be in its due time. If something has been speeded up, then it is coming earlier than its due time. So how can we possibly reconcile in a single concept the idea that the Mashiach and all this messianic period will appear at its due time, but it'll have been hastened? Okay, so the Gemara itself brings up this conundrum and answers that it depends. It's one of those dual perspective psukim that requires to look at the pasuk as two possibilities, as not as a single possibility where you see a contradiction. So the Gemara says, the itar, that's im lo zachu. If the Jewish people are not meritorious, then the Mashiach will still come, but it will come at a time which, so to speak, is pre-planned and will not be brought forward. In other words, there's a timetable. And even if the Jewish people aren't especially meritorious, that timetable will still be preserved. The railways will run according to a timetable. And that will be the idea of the itar, the Mashiach coming in his due time. Achishena is a different scenario. That's the possibility that the Bnei Yisrael will do tshuva and will suddenly recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and their conduct will be at a completely different level. When that happens, Achishena, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will hasten, and the arrival of Mashiach, Messianic times, will be before the Be'ita. So there are two possibilities, and those possibilities are in our hands. Be'ita, if we don't deserve it thoroughly, and Achishena, if we do deserve it thoroughly, then, so to speak, the Godus will end early. That's the way the Gemara reconciles this apparent contradiction. And of course, if you understand this reconciliation, you can employ it as well in understanding the difference between the Beis HaMikdash descending from the heavens overnight and that of the gradualist Maimonidean interpretation, what happens through human behaviors in the natural way. And you would say that the descent that Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai was concerned about, that it might come down overnight, is because he's concerned, so to speak, concerned in quotation marks, for the miraculous arrival and the sudden arrival due to a fantastic new repentant spirit in the Jewish people. That'll bring it about Achishena. That's the Achishena mode of arrival of the Beis HaMikdash. However, the idea that we see in other Midrashim, that it'll come down in a naturalistic way, and the one which is adopted by Rambam, Maimonides, in his Sefer Melachim, in his Mishnah Torah, conforms with the Be'ita, that it comes at a time which is pre-programmed, even if the Bnei Yisrael aren't that word. I can't prevent the shipwood sim upstairs. I'm afraid you're going to have to bear through the noise and grit your teeth, which is something we have to do here, day in, day out, and probably for the next year or so, as they drill their way through the apartment underneath us. Okay, I'm going to return. I'll stop sharing screen on that little note, really, on our previous learning, and we'll start this new Mishnah, which is a historical Mishnah again. Interesting. It harks back to the time of the Beis HaMikdash and the way things were, if you like. And that was before a time of drilling, so you could actually hear the learning more clearly. So I'm going to take you to the beginning of this new Mishnah, which is 3, 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10 lines from the top of Mem Aleph on the base, middle of the line. Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag. Your test is Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag. The first day of Sukkot. Chag, the festival here, is referring to Chag HaSukkot. It doesn't refer to any random Pesach, Shavuos, or Sukkot. This is definitely Sukkot. Shechal lihiyot b'Shabbat. That fell on a Shabbat. So the first day of Sukkot, which often happens, falls on a Shabbat. Kol ha'om molichen es lulavehen lebeis hakneses. All the people would bring their lulav and esrog, etc., to shul actually on the Friday afternoon before Shabbos came in. A little bit of a background over here. What do we do when the first day of Sukkot falls on Shabbos, or any day of Sukkot falls on Shabbos? We do not take the Arba Minim. That's our practice. However, this Mishnah is giving us the practice at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. At the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the practice was to take in Yerushalayim the lulav and esrog even on Shabbos. When I say take it, I mean they would bench Lulav and Esrog. And this Mishnah is telling us, how would they take it to shul? And the Mishnah is telling us that they didn't take it to shul on the Shabbos morning in order to shake around for Hallel and make a bracha on, but rather they brought it Erev Shabbos because they didn't want to carry their Lulav and Esrog during the Shabbos itself, because carrying is something we're not allowed to do. We're failing in the absence of an Erev. In the absence of an Erev, there is no carrying. But since the mitzvah of Arba Minim still applied, they brought those Arba Minim into shul early on Friday, so it would be available for them on a Shabbos. And let's just go on before we discuss any problems that we think that arises for us. Lamocharas, on the next day, that means on Shabbos morning in the day, mashkimin, they would get up early. I'm not sure why we have this, like hashkama minim. Some raised the question of why the Mishnah says mashkim, we get up early. On every Shabbos morning, you go to whatever minyan you went to. If you went to the hashkama minyan, you'd get up early. If you went to a late minyan, you'd come late. So the presence of this word mashkim in the Mishnah is a little bit of a mystery. Nevertheless, ubo'in, and they would come to shul. Bo'in means they would arrive at shul in the normal way on a Shabbos morning, and then kol echad ve'echad makira shelo v'notelo. Every person would identify his personal set of Arba Minim and take his personal set of Arba Minim. The Mishnah is going to explain why that is an important detail that needs to be added. It would have your name on, right, and your Te'udat Sahut number, so it was unambiguous which was your own Lulav and Esrog. Why? Why do you need to do this? Why can't we just all share anything that comes to mind? The first Lulav and the first table, just take it for ourselves. The answer is because the sages said, and this is something we learned earlier on, a person can't do a mitzvah of Arba Minim on day one of Sukkot with somebody else's Lulav and Esrog. He's got to use his own. Why? Do you remember? Because it's ulakachtem lochem b'yom harishon. You have to take what belongs to you. You can't use a borrowed Lulav and Esrog on day one. You can on day 2 and day 3 and day 4 and day 5, but not on day 1, because it says on day 1 it's got to be lochem. We got into this discussion about having a child, and if you give it to a child, you may have essentially lost legal possession of it. So on day 1, we have to be very careful. As the Gemara will explain, if somebody else is going to use your lulav, it has to be a matana given to them, al-manash lahachzir. You give them a gift, you gift it to them formally, and they gift it to you back, so to speak. And then it belongs to them for the period that they're doing the mitzvah. But when you arrive at shul, what you need to do over here on this first day, and they're on the tables there, you have to find your own, so that you are making the mitzvah with what is personally your own. On the first day, you cannot use somebody else's. However, as the Mishnah says, however, on the other days of the festival, you don't even need to identify your Lulav and Esrog. In theory, there was a stock of them at shul. You just take the first one you find. Of course, everyone is very what's the word, guarding of their own Lulav and Esrog. Personally, you feel it's like your personal property. Nobody's going to let somebody else use their Lulav and Esrog. You pay handsomely for it. But in principle, that's not the case. There's a stock of Lulav and Esrog, and you take whichever one you want. On the first day, the exception is you've got to find your own. Just before we do the second half of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi adds something, an interesting gloss on the second half of the Mishnah. What is this Mishnah implying to us? It's implying to us that you do take Lulav and Esrog in the first day, at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, even if it was on Shabbos. Why don't we do so today? We don't. Even on the first day of Sukkot, which is Minha Torah, we abandon the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog. It's outrageous. We go to shul, and we miss the most key day with the Lulav and Esrog. The next day, day 2, is only Drabonon outside Yerushalayim, and we merely take Al Lulav and Esrog today. We've abandoned the mitzvah of the Torah on day 1 when it falls on a Shabbos. They did not do this at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Why do we do this today? So we find in the Gemara various gezerot that were made, whereby a mitzvah that should be done, even if it's a mitzvah min ha-Torah, if there's a risk of us being machalel Shabbos, we rather put aside the mitzvah in order to guard closely to us the mitzvah of Shemira Shabbos, the Malachos of Shabbos. And here there's a risk that you might carry out, if we do allow you to take Lulav and Esrog on Shabbos, then people might carry their Lulav and Esrog in the street, not take it the night before, but rather, and not make the bracha at home, but sort of innocently carry it through the street as they would do in day 2 and day 3. And then there would be Mechalel Shabbos, because you're not allowed to carry more than 4 amas outside, who take from a private place to a public place, or a public place to a private place. It's an Isser of Melacha on Shabbos. So therefore, they made a gezerah in order to safeguard Shabbos, that they would put aside the din of Lulav on day 1. And the same thing goes with Tekiyah Chauffeur. When that falls on a Shabbos, we don't blow shofar, even though it's a din min ha-Torah. How come? Because you might take it somewhere you might not leave it in shul the 8th day before and take it through the streets on Shabbos. That itself is a very, very big, long discussion, how we can put aside a Torah rule in order simply to preserve the unlikely event that somebody might come and carry outside. It seems a little bit strange. Just tell people not to. If there's no area, you tell people not to. Why do you put aside a mitzvah? Let them keep their lulav at shul from Friday afternoon, like we see in this Mishnah, or leave a shofar at shul. Why do we abandon the mitzvah of lulav and shofar in order to prevent us carrying when it's so unlikely we would do so? Okay, so there we will see there's lots of discussion. That's not the central issue here, why that the gezerah is in place today. However, at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there was not such a gezerah in place, and you would take Lulav and Esrog. However, you still couldn't carry Melacha Shel Shabbos and Melacha Shel Shabbos. So therefore, the Mishnah is telling you what they used to do, which is to bring it already on Erev Shabbos. Problem number 2, which is often brought up with this particular Mishnah, is it implies that there's no Erev. You must be all jumping up and down and saying, here we are. We're talking about Yerushalayim. We're talking about the time of Beis HaMikdash. Ir HaKodesh, a walled city, possibly even as well, just to make things more difficult. What on earth inhibits carrying in Yerushalayim? Nowadays, we have a huge city and we have an Erev. All right, let's build a Badatz Erev around Yerushalayim. Couldn't they have done that at the time of Beis HaMikdash? Why did they not do so? Why does it say over here there was an Issar of prohibition against carrying in the streets, which required people to bring their lulav and esrog the night before? It seems from this Mishnah and a few other places in Shas that there was no carrying in Yerushalayim at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, which seems very strange. And there's speculation on this. I have to say, no one gives a satisfactory answer to this. One answer that has been given is that, but when it comes to the time of the Regal, there were so many people coming into Yerushalayim, like 1 million people. They came from all around the world, Ali al Regal, including on Sukkot, of course, that somehow the whole of Yerushalayim became like a motorway, a Rishus Harabim, and therefore you're not allowed to build an Erev around a Rishus Harabim. I mean, what is a Rishus Harabim is itself a big question. You can only build a Rishus Harabim in a place where it's not awesome in HaTorah to carry, but when you have something which has 1 million people in all the highways and byways, in and out of Yerushalayim, as people coming up Ali al Regel, it invalidates the building of an Erev. That's one possible reason given. This is very difficult, because Yerushalayim itself was also walled at the time. It's even walled today around the 12th, 13th century walls around it. A smaller part of it was certainly walled at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, and that certainly should have been an area you could carry in. Certainly, even if there were 1 million people there. It's like having a huge Rishus HaYochid, like being in a large walled garden. We don't say that just because there's more than 20 people in there, you can't carry in the garden. So that's still a little bit strange. So others want to say, well, you know what? A lot of parts of Eretz Yisrael didn't have Eruvim, so they made a rule. You know, so many people come to Yerushalayim when they come back again to their place in Petach Tikva where there is no Erev. They might say, hey, you know, Yerushalayim we could carry, maybe we can carry outside as well. All sorts of reasons are given. Whatever the reason is, and we're not 100% sure, it seems that carrying was forbidden. They were not as lucky as we are. And therefore, they had to bring their Lulav and Esrik to Shul on Friday afternoon. And because the first day is a Shabbos, they had to make sure they each picked up the correct Lulav and Esrik. That seems to be the interpretation of the Mishnah over here. Okay, let's just go on a little bit further. Now, let me take up a Tosfos, and I'll do that Tosfos later on during the Gemara. Okay. Rabbi Yossi Omer, I'm finishing the Mishnah, the last line or two of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi said, he adds something here. Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag Shel Lihios B'Shabbos. In the situation where the first day of Sukkot falls on a Shabbos, which is the one that we've just been discussing, V'Shochach, he adds here an extra gloss, which is a halachic one, and it's a little bit more londish, a little bit more detailed in terms of the aspects of halacha it touches on. V'Shochach, if a person forgot somehow that it was Shabbos, and it's the first day of Sukkot, and what did he do? He was holding his Lulav and Esrik in the house, and he stepped outside into the street. V'hotzis ha-lulav l'rishus harabim, and he took out his Lulav into the street, which he shouldn't have done because there was no Erev. But innocently, through his love of the Lulav and Esrik, which he adores holding and fondling and keeping close to himself, he held on to it as he left the front door and he walked into the street. Then, patur, he is not liable. What does that mean, he's not liable? Let's just finish the Mishnah before we determine what it means. Mipnei shehotziu birshus, because he took it out birshus with approval. What does that mean? So if you read Rashi and the commentaries, it means this. Normally, when a person transgresses an avera min haTorah, which is of a serious nature, which would require the person to be punished in some way by Beis Din, such as Chayv Misa, or even something which is kores, which is another type of penalty within the Torah, then if he does so unwittingly, does so because he's forgotten, he was unaware of what he was doing, or he didn't know the halacha. In other words, he does not do it deliberately, but he non-deliberately violates a halacha of great importance. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, he would have to bring a korban chatos. He would have to bring a korban to be mechaper, to atone for a serious violation. Now, he's not punishable by Beis Din. No one's going to whip him or anything because he did not do so deliberately. But even not doing something deliberately is still breaking a boundary that the Torah set. And indeed, you could say that there is some level of guilt and culpability in a person who does something unwittingly, because if he's truly aware of everything he should be aware of, then he wouldn't have overstepped the mark even unwittingly. Yeah, we innocently do things only because our minds are on things. But that itself is a flaw in our character. And therefore, he has to bring a kapara. So at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, he would bring a korban chatos, and there would be a kapara. There would be some price to pay. He has to find this animal, go up to the Yerushalayim and bring a korban chatos. It certainly meant you were more careful about overstepping the mark. You wouldn't daydream quite as much if you had to bring a korban chatos every time that you unwittingly overstep the mark. So that's the normal situation. So if a person carries on Shabbos, which is a chayiv kores, in the situation you do deliberately, where he does so unwittingly, he would normally bring a korban chatos. However, Rabbi Yossi is adding something here of interest. He's saying, if the person was carrying out his lulav and esrog, even though he is unwittingly violating the malacha of carrying on Shabbos, and if the guy had taken out a cup or a saucer or a chair into the street, he would have to bring a korban chatos. If he took out his lulav and esrog, he doesn't. He's potter from bringing his korban chatos. He's exempt. Why? Because he was essentially involved in his mind in a mitzvah. The rishus means the approval, means that essentially what he took out was a ma'aseh mitzvah. If he takes out a cold cup of coffee, there's no mitzvah to take a cup of coffee into the street, and therefore he has to bring a korban chatos as a kapara. Where he takes out his lulav and esrog, which is a ma'aseh mitzvah, he knows today's the first day of Sukkot. He's taking it out because he wants to do a mitzvah. Then he doesn't need to bring a kapara, right? It's a bit of a soothing factor over here. If you take out something unwittingly, overstep the mark because you've been daydreaming, but what you took out was something which is of nothing to do with a mitzvah, then you have to bring a kapara. But if you take out something which is, after all, a ma'aseh mitzvah, even though you shouldn't have done, you should have done that mitzvah at home or brought it to shul on the afternoon the day before. Nevertheless, we are a little bit more lenient on you and say you don't need a kapara. For this aveira, b'shogeg, for this unwitting violation, you don't need to bring a kapara. This is the chiddush of Rabbi Yossi. Okay. If you hadn't said that, you might have thought you would have to bring chatos, even for taking out your lulav and esrog. After all, did you violate or did you not violate the transgression of carrying the rishus harabim? You did. Whether you transgressed it by taking out a lulav or taking out a cup of coffee. However, it says Rabbi Yossi that in this situation where you take out a lulav, that violation doesn't require a kapara. It's still something you should be very concerned about. A person who has done something he shouldn't do should be concerned about. Okay. Now the Gemara will start. The Gemara starts Mino Hanimili. Again, whenever the Gemara says Mino Hanimili, it means where do we know these things from? Which means what source do we have in a verse in the Torah to justify what the Mishnah has said? What did the Mishnah say? We're referring here to the statement in the Mishnah that on the first day of Sukkot, a person has to use his own lulav and esrog, right? So he comes to shul on the Shabbos morning. He can't just pick up the first one on the table that he finds. He has to identify his own. Why? Because on the first day of Sukkot, you have to use what belongs to you, shalochem. Whereas on the other days, you can actually use somebody else's. As long as he gives you permission, you can use somebody else's. On the first, it has to be yours. What's the source? Asks the Gemara over here. And we quoted this halacha many times before. But really, the source of halacha, the source of the question being asked, is here. So the Gemara says to Tana Rabbanan, because the rabbis taught in a brisa, the source will be in this brisa, which is a Mishnaic contemporary source. It's a brisa, quoting the word ulakachtem. This pasuk essentially analyzes the two words ulakachtem lochem. Ulakachtem lochem b'yom harishon. The Torah says you should take ulakachtem lochem, that which belongs to you. So says the brisa, ulakachtem, you shall take. The first part, the brisa notes about ulakachtem, is an interesting thing in itself. What does the Torah say? Ulakachtem shetehei lekicha b'yad kol echad ve'echad. Why does it use the plural and you shall take? We'll see in a moment. Sometimes when the Torah instructs a mitzvah, it does so in the plural. And sometimes in the singular. The Torah could have said ulakachta, you shall take, in the singular, addressing you as individuals, or could say ulakachtem lochem, you all, the whole public, shall take. What this differentiates one from the other, we'll see from the way the brisa looks at this plural. Lekachtem shetehei lekicha b'yad kol echad ve'echad. That means there should be a taking, ulakach, b'yad kol echad ve'echad, for every person in the population. This is something you think is so staringly obvious. But in fact, the Tana of this brisa is telling you, you've got to find it somewhere before it's really obvious. A mitzvah sometimes is not a mitzvah that needs to be done by everybody. And we'll give you an example that the Rishonim give, which will illustrate this much better, when it can be in the singular rather than the plural. If it's in the singular, it might mean that the mitzvah is only on the Beis Din, that there is a mitzvah that something should be done, but you don't have to do so as individuals. All the members of Beis Knesset Hanasi don't have to do it. If we say the chief rabbi of Jerusalem does it for us, and he's motzi all of us. That's a possibility. But when it says ulakachtem, it means everyone, all of you have to do it. So that's the first thing. Each one of us has a din of mitzvah. We can't rely on anybody else. Our own person, it's a mitzvah which is personal to each individual. And then the piece that we really need, Misha lochem, is Misha lochem. That's the bit that answers the question. How do we know a person has to use their own lulav and esrog on day one? Because it says lochem, which is Misha lochem, it has to be something that belongs to you, not something that belongs to somebody else. Lahotzi, to exclude on the first day, this excludes hashol ves hagozel, something which is borrowed or stolen. Again, in other words, I can't use something, if I just say, can you lend me your lulav and it's day one? No, it's lochem. It's not mine if I borrow it from you. I'm borrowing something that belongs to you. It has to be gifted to me. Neither if I've stolen it, I can't fulfill the deed either. That was more complicated. We did some things about it, because if you steal it, you can actually bring it into your possession. But straightforwardly, it doesn't belong to you, and therefore you can't perform a mitzvah on day one with a stolen lulav. Mikan amru chachamim. From here, the sages made this rule: Ein adam yotzi de chavasa b'yom tov harishon shel chag. A person cannot fulfill his obligation on the first day of Sukkot, the lulavo shel chavero, with a lulav that belongs to his fellow man, elim kain lesono lo b'matana, unless it was given to him as a matana. You can gift your lulav to someone, and then it belongs to him. He gifts it back to you, and you got it back again. That's fine. But if all you've done is a borrowing arrangement, and it's all in the mind and all in the statement, in a sense, you can't just presume because somebody's taken from you that he's borrowed, that it's a borrow, that it's being gifted to you, that person has got it as a gift. You have to actually say, you want to use my lulav on day one, but if this is a matana, but please give it back to me on condition that you give it back to me. That works. But if you just give it to him, essentially he may not perform the mitzvah at all. He may be making a bracha lavatola. So that's something to be considered. And the source is lochem. I wanted to give you an example here about the use of the singular plural. This is also very interesting. We've just said the obvious. Ulakachten means everybody's going to mitzvah to do arba minim. Well, isn't that obvious? But let me give you another example where you see that it's not as obvious as you might have suspected. There are at least two halachas in the mitzvah in relation to counting. Counting. Well, one of them, you know, is Sefiras Omer, where you count days. There's another one which is less famous because we don't keep the Yovel anymore, and that is counting the years of the Omer. That's, you know, which is year one, which is the 50th year is going to be the Jubilee year, which is the 7th year is going to be the Shemitah year. You've got to know which year you're counting in, otherwise you don't know when's Shemitah and you don't know when's Yovel. So the Torah gives you a singular counting example and a plural counting example, and you'll see that they're differentiated by the language. When it comes to counting the years of the years in order to establish which is the Jubilee year, and then you pronounce the Jubilee year and you liberate all your servants and everybody goes back to their home land, all those halachas that relate to the Yovel year in biblical times, the Torah says, Usafar ta'locha. That's singular. How do we understand that? That means there's only a singular counting. So the Chazal say that means the Beis Din do that counting. There's no din that everybody in their homes each year has to say, this is the 7th year of the Jubilee cycle. This is the 50th year of the Jubilee cycle. It's not an individual counting. This is something that's done only by the Sanhedrin, if you like, on behalf of the Jewish population in setting the calendar. That's why it says Sefat Halacha, singular. The singular refers to the Beis Din as a unit, as a single unit. However, there's another type of counting, which is for us all, and it's in the plural. Usafartem lachem, right? And this is Sheva Shabbos Temilas Tiyatu Machras Shabbos. This is Severas Omer. Usafatim Lachem. And that's we start on the 16th of the Omer. Sheva Shabbos, you start 49 days. It's Lachem, and it's Sefartem, and it's plural. So that's not just for the Beis Din to do. That's not for the Sanhedrin to do. That's for every individual person to count the Omer. So you can see that that's an example where the singular use is an instruction that the mitzvah is only for the Beis Din. The plural use shows that the mitzvah is for everyone. So that's one model where you can see the difference between the singular and the plural. So over here, that's why the writer says ulakachtem, which is a plural, shows that this is a mitzvah for every member of the public to do, and they do that as individuals. Now, I just wanted to, before going on in this Gemara, which goes into greater details as to how, if there's only one lulav, you share it. I wanted to have a look at a Tosfos, which I actually did not print out for you. It was a bit naughty. Remind myself of the content. Okay, so Tosfos brings a contemporary fact. Maybe what I don't know if I got it there anymore. Okay, no, I'll have to find it. So Tosfos brings a contemporary question. Contemporary means contemporary to Tosfos. Tosfos says, well, we've just learned this halacha that a lulav and esrog has got to belong to you on the first day of Sukkot. Forget about Shabbos, just the general rule that it has to belong to you on the first day of Shabbos, because it says ulakaftem lochem, has to belong to you as individuals. So he asked this following question. He said, Ashul's nowadays, says he 800 years ago, they used to buy, okay, I'm just getting warning that low audio quality. I apologize if you're getting low audio quality because of limited bandwidth. They used to buy a lulav and esrog for the whole community because the individuals weren't able to buy their own lulav and esrog, lack of resources, lack of money, lack of availability, or whatever. And they did so b'shutfus. They did so as a sort of partnership. So you paid your 5 pence or 5 shekels, everybody paid a certain amount, and therefore the lulav and esrog were bought in shutfus. And in partnership, everyone has, if you like, a fractional ownership in the Arba Minim. So he questions this. He questions their own, if you like, conduct. And he says, how do we do that? We know that there's a rule that as a result of lachem, everybody has to have a full ownership in the lulav and esrog, because otherwise it's not really lachem. It's li, v'shalo, v'shalo, v'shalo. It's hundreds of lachems. It's not just mine anymore. So how do they get away with benching lulav and esrog on a jointly owned lulav and esrog in the shul? How are they correctly being mekayim the mitzvah? He asks this question about how they can justify their own conduct. And the answer he gives is an interesting one. He says it's not bought by some one person and then gifted from one to the other. They don't do this. They actually buy in as a joint. They all have a 5% share, so to speak, in the lulav and esrog. But how can that work as if not a violation of lachem? So he explains that what should happen then in this situation is that since everybody knows that they have a part ownership in the lulav and esrog, each one automatically in his mind abolishes his ownership, withdraws his formal ownership of his share at the moment somebody else is making a bracha. It's very sophisticated, right? So you have one person who's just about to make his bracha of lulav and esrog, but he's only got a 5% share. You've got the other 19 people who are standing nearby who've also got each a 5% share. So how can the person who's now taking his hands with his 5% share discharge his obligation? So at the moment he takes it, all the other 19 people are mentally abrogating their ownership that they have. So all of a sudden, there's no 95% of anyone else's. There's only the share of ownership that the individual who's about to make the bracha has, and lo and behold, it all belongs to him. Magic. I hope you enjoyed that. That is Tosfos trying to justify how they do what they did then. And it's sophisticated, and you might say, oh, this is all very much a fiddle. But don't forget that ownership, again, is very much in the mind halachically. We learned this, years ago. We were picking up of lost articles. We talked about a person, yish, despair. Despair grants the ownership in the person who picks up the article. Why doesn't it belong to him anymore? Because he's lost hope of ever giving it back. There's a lot in halacha which is not the same as would appeal to the Western mind. A lot of it's in the, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. To some extent, ownership is in the eye of the beholder as well. And that's why you can be mavatel, you can do hefka, you can make something ownerless on Erev Pesach. We say kol chamira chamir ikibishusi. We abolish the ownership we have in the chametz. Even stuff that's still in our house doesn't belong to us anymore. It's all in the mind. And therefore, a state of mind where you abrogate your share of ownership correctly transfers the ownership out of you to somebody else. And if 19 people lose their ownership, there's only the 20th person who's the sole owner at the time he makes the bracha. A beautiful little answer to Tosfos. And this is another way you can actually have joint ownership. These things, by the way, are not recommended. This is Tosfos trying to give you a sophisticated answer to a question which is very important because they couldn't find more than one set. Nowadays, we have a luxury of separate sets of Lulav and Esrogim. We don't resort to this kind of sophistry anymore because it is a form of sophistry. Maybe we're not thinking correctly. Maybe we don't have the focused mindset they had at the time of the Baalei Tosfos. If everyone Beit Knesset Hanossi were all making obtaining joint ownership in one Lulav and Esrog, and all had to remember that they were abrogating ownership in favor of somebody else making the bracha, it might be quite a large ask of us as individuals. So we don't rely on that anymore. But where there is no other resort, then you have to resort to whatever complex solutions are available. Let's just go on with the Gemara a little bit now. We're on Umasa b'Rabbi Gamliel, b'Rabbi Hoshua, b'Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, b'Rabbi Akiva. It sounds a little bit like we're going back to the Haggadah. Masa Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, Yeshua ibn Barak, etc. It sounds a little like that. It's another one of these stories where you have the great Tanoim, who were the sages of Yavne, who were on a ship together. They were not taking a cruise. I very much thought they were taking a cruise on a liner, which is what many rabbis probably can do today. But at the time, these Rabbonim were probably on a national mission. It's often said they were on a mission. They probably were on a boat on the Mediterranean. Maybe they were coming from Lebanon. Maybe they were coming from Rome. And they were on a boat coming back again. And they might have been on some sort of appeal to the governors to make life easy for them in Judea. Because here we have the leading lights, and they're all together on a journey. And journeys by boats were very dangerous, and they were only undertaken if there was some important national mission. So they were all born Baspina, and it was the first day of Sukkot. That's another thing you wouldn't do. The first day of Sukkot comes in, and they're still on a boat. They're not near shuls. They're on a boat in the Mediterranean. For Lo Hoya Lulav, Ela the Rabban Gamliel Bilbao. There was one Lulav. They were, shall we say, well prepared enough to bring one Lulav on board. One Lulav means one set of Arbanim. And that was Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was the Nossi, and he had the only Lulav, Shelakacho be'elef zuz, which he had bought for 1,000 zuz. I imagine whenever he started out his journey, wherever he came from, it was very difficult to get hold of a Lulav and Esrog. So at enormous expense, he invested in one Lulav and Esrog. And now that's the only Lulav and Esrog. It's day one. And each one of these sages wants to have a Lulav and Esrog which belongs to them, which is just the situation we discussed a moment ago. So how are they all going to make a bracha on Rabban Gamliel's Lulav and Esrog? So here's the story. Netola Rabban Gamliel v'yotzado. Rabban Gamliel first took the Lulav and Esrog, and he made a bracha on the Lulav and Esrog, and he was mekayim him with his mitzvah, and that's fine because it belonged to him. So at this point, there is obviously going to be no problem. It was his. Then unusono le Rabbi Yoshua matona, and he gave it then to Rabbi Yoshua as a matona, which is exactly the instruction we were given, the eitzah we were given in the Brisa. He gave it over to Rabbi Yoshua as a gift, so that it would, for that moment that he was fulfilling the mitzvah, it would belong to Rabbi Yoshua. Natolo Rabbi Yoshua v'yotzabo. Rabbi Yoshua then made his bracha on it and was yotzer. He was able to fulfill his mitzvah. Unasono le Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah b'matana. Rabbi Yoshua is now the owner because it was given to him as a matana. So Rabbi Yoshua now can gift it in succession to Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. Natolo Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah v'yotzabo. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah was then able to take the lulav and be yotzer, fulfill his mitzvah. Unasono maton le Rabbi Akiva, now it belongs to Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. He can gift it through in turn to Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva took it. Natala Rabbi Akiva yotzabo. This is a nice chain here. Rabbi Akiva took it and was yotzer. Vehechaziro le Rabban Gamliel. And Rabbi Akiva then returned it to Rabban Gamliel. And the Gemara says here, ask this question. So it's fine now. We see how they all work within the parameters of the advice we saw before by successive gifting, which always grants ownership to the person who is holding the gift. So it says the Gemara, Lama li lamei mehechaziro. Why does the story mention that it was given back to Rabban Gamliel right at the tail end? The Gemara is saying, do we really need to know that it was given back to Rabban Gamliel? The only conundrum over here, the only problem at the outset was that all of these Tanorim should be able to discharge the obligations. They did. Whether or not they give it back to Rabban Gamliel, they discharged their obligation because at the time they took the Lulav and Esrog, it always belonged to them as individuals. So why does the story end up saying it was returned to Rabban Gamliel as if it were part and parcel of this whole arrangement? We didn't learn at the beginning it was part and parcel of the arrangement to give it to Rabban Gamliel at the end. So the Gemara says why? Milsa agav orchei kamashmalam. The Brisa bringing you the story wanted to inform you of something on the side that what? That matana al manas lahachazir shema matana. That the approach of giving a matana with a condition that that matana be returned is considered to be a valid legal matana. What do we mean over here? This is the way we always recommend it be done. But if you think for a moment, isn't this a fiddle too far? If I say to somebody comes to me, they haven't got a Lulav Esrog on the first day. So they say, can I borrow your Lulav Esrog? So I say to them, no, you can't, because it's first day, it's got to belong to you. However, I can give it to you as a matana. But I don't want to give it to this guy as a matana, because I know he's run away with other people's Lulav Esrog before. I want it back again, because otherwise I haven't got a Lulav Esrog in day 2 and day 3. So I say to him, which is what we would normally say, this is a matana I'm giving to you as a matana al manas lahazir. It's a matana on condition that it's returned. And we'll see later on that this is a powerful condition. And it's condition that will determine the validity of the person, of the mitzvah the person does. I say to them, I'm giving this to you on condition that you return it. It will belong to you for the period that you are making the bracha. Instantly, there will be a liability on you to return it to me. So that, you might say, shouldn't work. You might think, as a Western trained, university academically trained individual, that's not a gift. So the chiddush of this case that we just learned is it is a gift. It formally works. This was gifted down the chain. The original gift that Rabban Gamliel made, although he didn't specify it, we understanding now to have been a matana al manas lahachzir. It was a gift on the specified conditions when we return to Rabban Gamliel. So the Brisa wants to inform you that Rabbi Akiva returned it to Rabban Gamliel, and therefore the condition was fulfilled. But everyone who who took Lulav and Esrog in between has fulfilled their the mitzvah obligation. And we don't say that a matana al manas lahachzir, a gift which is only a gift, but it needs to be returned, isn't a gift. You know, if someone said to me they were going to give me whatever it is, they were going to give me their diamond ring and I can sell it, you know, but the instant I get it, it belongs to me, but has to be handed back straight away, I would say that's not a gift. I don't consider that to be a gift. It's a phony gift. However, halacha does not consider this to be a phony gift. For the instant that it's with a person to do the bracha, it's considered to be a full abrogation of ownership by the gifter, and it belongs to the person it's gifted to. And the Gemara will say, and we'll carry on with this next week before we go into the Gemara is going to say, and this is a very important feature of the gift. Supposing Rabbi Akiva had not returned it to Rabban Gamliel at the end of this chain, it violates the condition. The condition Rabban Gamliel gave it through in the first place was that it should be returned to him. It was a gift which is valid, but it'll only be validated by the end of the chain. And if the end of the chain returns it to Rabban Gamliel, it's been gifted correctly all the way through. Suppose Rabbi Akiva decided to throw this lulav overboard. Not only is he stealing from Rabban Gamliel, that's the least of it. Everyone who's made a bracha up to now has made a bracha levatala. Isn't that incredible? Retroactively, the mitzvah that they should have done has been taken away from them because the gift was on a condition. The condition can only be fulfilled at the end. Failing to fulfill the condition retrospectively invalidates the terms of the gift, and it's as if the gift was never made. It was if Rabban Gamliel never handed those Lulav and Esrogs over in the first place, and they had been stolen by Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. That is the importance and the implication of the matana manas lahachzir. It's not a fiddle at all because it has a very, very big sting in the tail. And but over here we see the story came out good, and it was given back to Rabbi Akiva, which validated the chain of gifts and meant they all made a proper bracha on their lulav and esrog. So we'll stop over here and we'll come back to this time. Let me just stop the recording.
Ellie, do you hear me?
Yes.